The dust had been her only companion for 3 days. It coated the inside of her mouth, settled in a fine red film on her worn dress, and worked its way into the cracks of her soul. When Lila Rose finally saw the turnoff for the Kane Ranch, it was not with relief, but with a deepening of the hollow ache in her gut. The stagecoach had left her at a dusty crossroads with nothing but a half canteen of water and a pointed finger. "That way," the driver had grunted. "If you have a death wish." She had walked since sunup, following a track that was little more than 2 faint lines pressed into the unforgiving earth. The land out here did not welcome. It endured. The wind was a constant, a low moan that swept across the plains, rattling the brittle skeletons of last year's grass, and carrying the scent of nothing but distance. The sky was a pale, endless blue, so vast and empty it felt like a weight, a crushing lid on the world that made a person feel small and foolish for even trying. She felt like a fly crawling across a giant's plate, certain that at any moment she could be seen and swatted out of existence. The note had been tacked to the splintered back wall of a saloon in dusty Redemption, a town that offered none. It was written in a dark, slashing hand on a piece of butcher paper. Cook wanted. No questions asked. Room and board. Below it, a crudely drawn map showed the way to the K-Bar-K Ranch. No questions asked. Those were the 4 most beautiful words Lila had ever read. They were a prayer answered, a key to a lock she thought had rusted shut forever. Questions were hooks. They snagged on your past and dragged it, thrashing and bloody, into the present. She had no answers left to give, only a desperate need for a place to disappear. The ranch house was not what she expected. It was a long, low structure of dark, weathered timber, built to withstand a siege. It hunkered down against the land as if it knew the wind was its enemy. A stone chimney, solid and square, rose from one end. Smoke, thin and gray, feathered from its top. The only sign of life besides a few scattered longhorn cattle grazing in the distance. There were no flowers, no garden, no woman's touch to soften the hard edges of the place. It was a man's world, stark and functional. A corral stood nearby, its fence posts like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. A barn, larger than the house, loomed behind it. The whole place was silent, save for that ceaseless, whispering wind. As she drew closer, her steps faltering in the loose dirt of the yard, the front door of the house opened. A man stepped onto the porch and stood there, watching her approach. He was tall, built of the same hard materials as the land itself. He wore dark, dusty trousers and a collarless shirt that had been washed so many times it had faded to the color of the sky. He did not move, did not call out a greeting. He just waited, his arms crossed over his chest, his presence a wall she had to walk directly into. Lila stopped a dozen feet from the porch, her small bundle of belongings clutched in one hand. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the scuffed toes of his boots. They were old, scarred, and coated in the same red dust that covered everything. She could feel his eyes on her, and the sensation was like being touched by something rough. "You the cook?" His voice was what she imagined rocks would sound like if they could speak. It was low and full of gravel, with no warmth in it at all. She could only manage a nod, her throat tight and dry. "You look half-starved," he said. It was not an expression of concern. It was a flat statement of fact, as if he were assessing livestock. He still had not moved. The note said, "Room and board. I provide the board. You cook it. The room is in the back. It is small. The hands eat at sunup and sundown. I eat when I am hungry. You will keep the kitchen clean. You will keep out of the way. That is all." He turned then, as if the transaction were complete, and went back inside, leaving the door ajar. He had not asked her name. He had not offered her a dipper of water. He had not smiled or nodded or given any of the small courtesies that oiled the workings of the world. But he had not touched her. He had not even made a move for Lila. That was more than enough. It was everything. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding and mounted the 2 wooden steps to the porch. Inside, the house was dark and smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and man. A long table with benches on either side dominated the main room. A stone fireplace, cold now, filled one wall. To her right was the kitchen, a space of iron and wood. A massive cast-iron stove stood against the far wall. Shelves held tin plates and mugs, sacks of flour and beans. It was a space built for work, not comfort. She found the room he had mentioned at the end of a short, dark hallway. It was small, as he had said. A narrow cot with a thin mattress and a single gray blanket was pushed against one wall. A small, rough-hewn table and a 3-legged stool stood beneath a single square window that looked out onto the endless expanse of dry grass. There was a nail hammered into the wall to hang her things. That was all. No rug, no curtains, no mirror. It was a cell, but the door had no lock on the outside. She set her bundle down on the cot. It contained one spare dress, a brush, and a small, cracked photograph of a woman who looked like her, but with light in her eyes. The first few days passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Lila learned the rhythm of the ranch through sound, the jingle of spurs and the low murmur of men's voices before dawn. The clang of the iron triangle. One of the hands rang to signal a meal. The heavy, measured tread of Caleb Kane's boots on the floorboards. A sound that always made the muscles in her back and shoulders tighten into knots. She moved through the house like a ghost, a shadow in long sleeves and a downturned gaze. Even in the oppressive heat of the kitchen, with sweat beading on her forehead and trickling down her spine, she never rolled up the sleeves of her dress. They were her armor, her shield. She cooked simple, hearty food. Bacon, beans, sourdough biscuits that were not as light as her mother's but were edible. Stews made from tough beef and whatever root vegetables she could find in the root cellar. She was a decent cook, a skill beaten into her over years of trying to please a man who could not be pleased. She worked mechanically, her mind a blank slate. She focused on the slice of the knife through a potato, the sizzle of salt pork in a hot skillet, the rhythmic thump of kneading dough. These were safe, predictable things. The ranch hands were a rough, weathered bunch. There were 4 of them. An old man named Silas, whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and who moved with the slow, deliberate pace of age. 2 younger men, brothers named Jed and Tom, who were loud in the bunkhouse, but quiet and watchful around the main house. And a half-wild boy of about 17 they called Gus, who seemed more comfortable with the horses than with people. They ate at the long table, their shoulders hunched, shoveling food into their mouths with an efficiency that left no time for conversation. They never spoke to her directly. They would nod in her direction, their eyes sliding away from hers as if looking at her for too long was a breach of some unwritten code. She would place the platters of food on the table and retreat to the kitchen, listening to the scrape of forks on tin plates. Caleb Kane ate alone, often long after the hands had finished. He would come in from the barn or the range, his face grim with exhaustion and caked with dust, and sit at the head of the empty table. She would place a plate in front of him, fill his mug with coffee, and then retreat. He never thanked her. He never commented on the food. He simply ate, his dark eyes focused on something far away. Sometimes she would watch him from the shadows of the kitchen doorway. He was a man carved from hardship. There were lines etched around his eyes that had nothing to do with squinting into the sun. It was a deep, abiding sorrow she recognized, a loneliness so profound it was like a physical presence, a cold spot in the room. It was from the hands that she learned about the ghosts. She would hear them talking sometimes, their voices carrying on the dry wind as she threw scraps to the chickens behind the house. "Boss is in one of his moods again," Jed would say. "He gets like this when the north wind blows." Silas would answer, his voice a low rumble. "Brings back memories." "What memories?" Gus, the boy, would ask, his curiosity getting the better of him. A long silence. Then Silas again. He ain't always been like this. Used to be a different man, before the fire, before he buried her. He buried a woman. Gus's voice was a whisper. Right out there, past the barn, under that lone cottonwood. Put up a marker and everything. Never speaks her name. Never speaks of it at all. Another voice. Tom's. Some say he's got ghosts. That is why he does not like women around the place. Reminds him of what he lost, or what he did. Lila would hurry back inside then, her heart pounding a dull, frightened rhythm against her ribs. He buried a woman. The words echoed in the silent corners of her mind. She would lie on her narrow cot at night, listening to the house settle and groan, and she would wonder about that grave under the cottonwood. She would wonder about the woman who lay in it, and what had put her there, and she would feel the familiar, icy grip of fear, the fear of a man with a dark past and a silent rage. She had traded one cage for another. Perhaps this one was just bigger, with a wider sky. The routine became a kind of shield. Sunup, coffee, bacon, biscuits, midday, bread, cold meat, beans, sundown, stew, coffee, cornbread, wash, scrub, sweep. She lost track of the days. They bled into one another, each one the same color as the dust. She spoke to no one, and no one spoke to her. The silence was a comfort, a blanket she could pull over her head. She was becoming as quiet and weathered as the landscape itself. She was disappearing, just as she had prayed for. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was like any other morning. The sun was a hot white disk on the horizon. The hands were at the table, eating with their usual silent haste. Lila moved back and forth from the stove, refilling the coffee pot, bringing another platter of biscuits. The heat was already building in the kitchen. A thin sheen of sweat covered her skin, making the long sleeves of her dress cling uncomfortably to her arms. She reached across the table to clear Jed's empty plate. As she did, the worn cuff of her right sleeve, damp with steam and sweat, snagged for a moment on the corner of the tin plate. It was just for a second, a small, insignificant thing, but it was enough. The cuff slid up her forearm, exposing the tender skin of her wrist. And the bruises, they were not fresh. They were a week old, maybe more. A constellation of ugly, mottled colors. Deep, angry purple fading to a sickly blue-black, ringed with a pale, jaundiced yellow. They were the distinct and terrible shape of a man's fingers, a story written on her skin in a language of violence she knew all too well. She froze. Time itself seemed to stop. She saw Jed's eyes flicker down, widen for a fraction of a second, and then quickly look away, a flush rising on his neck. Silas, across the table, sighed, a quiet, weary sound, and pushed his chair back. The moment was broken. Lila snatched her arm back, her sleeve falling back into place. But it was too late. The secret was out, laid bare on the breakfast table along with the salt pork and sorghum. She could feel Caleb Kane's eyes on her from the head of the table. He had been watching, as he always did, his gaze sweeping over the room with a kind of detached vigilance. But now, that gaze was fixed on her. It was heavy, it was sharp, it pinned her in place. He said nothing. He did not move a muscle. He just looked at her, and in his dark, unreadable eyes, she saw a flicker of something she could not name. It was not pity. It was not anger. It was something colder, harder. It was recognition. The hands finished their meal in record time, scraping their benches back and fleeing the room as if the devil himself were about to appear. Lila was left alone with him, the silence in the room thick and suffocating. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run, to bolt for her room and burrow under the thin blanket, but her feet were rooted to the floor. She forced herself to move, her hands trembling as she gathered the empty plates. She could still feel his stare on her back, a physical weight. She carried the plates to the wash basin in the kitchen, her movements stiff and clumsy. She expected him to follow her, to corner her, to ask the questions he had promised he would not ask. But he remained at the table. She could hear the soft scrape of his chair as he pushed it back. She heard the heavy fall of his boots as he stood. This is it, she thought. He will send me away. Or worse. She clutched the edge of the iron sink, her knuckles white, and waited. The boot steps approached, not toward the kitchen, but toward the front door. He was leaving. Relief washed over her, so potent it left her weak. She risked a glance over her shoulder. He was at the door, his hand on the latch, his back to her. He was going to leave. He was going to pretend he had not seen. She turned back to the sink, her body slumping. She had survived. She could stay. She could continue to disappear. She began to pump water into the basin, the squeak of the handle loud in the silent house. Woman. His voice cut through the air, low and sharp. It was not a question. It was a command. Lila froze, her hand still on the pump handle. She did not turn around. You belong to me now. The words landed on her like stones. Every muscle in her body went rigid. The air rushed from her lungs, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. Belong. It was the ugliest word in the world. It was the word that had been branded on her soul by a hot iron. It was the word that meant pain, and chains, and the death of herself. She had run 1,000 miles to escape that word. And here it was again, in this empty house, in the mouth of this hard, silent man. Her vision tunneled. The kitchen seemed to tilt, the floor falling away from her feet. He was the same as all the others. He had seen the mark of ownership on her, and now he was claiming her as his own. Tears of pure, hot terror pricked her eyes. She had to run. She could not stay here. She could not do this again. She could not survive it. She let go of the pump handle and took a stumbling step toward the back door, toward the empty plains. Not like that. His voice came again, closer this time. The gravelly edge was still there, but it was rougher, as if the words were being forced out of him against their will. She stopped, her hand hovering over the latch of the back door. She did not dare to turn, did not dare to hope. Ain't no man lays a hand on you again while you're under my roof. The words hung in the air between them. They were not gentle. They were not kind. They were a statement of fact, as hard and unyielding as a granite boulder. It was not an offer of comfort. It was a declaration, a drawing of a line in the dust. This is my territory. What is on it is mine to protect, or to break. Lila stood there for a long time, her back to him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She heard his boots cross the floor. The front door opened and then shut with a solid, final thud. He was gone. She finally turned, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of a work table to keep from falling. The main room was empty. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Nothing had changed, yet everything was different. He had seen her weakness, her shame, and he had not used it against her. He had named it, and then he had built a wall around it, a wall with his words. Slowly, like an old woman, she made her way back to her room. She shut the door behind her and sank onto the edge of the cot, her body trembling. She stared at the rough wooden planks of the floor, seeing not the wood, but his dark, unreadable eyes. You belong to me now. The words still terrified her. They tasted of possession, of a cage. But his next words, they were something else entirely. Ain't no man lays a hand on you again. It was not a promise of gentleness. It was a promise of violence. A promise to meet violence with more violence, on her behalf. She did not know what to make of it. She did not know what to make of him. Was this a new kind of prison? One with a fierce and unpredictable warden? Or was it, impossibly, a shelter, a fortress with a garrison of one? She wrapped her arms around herself, her fingers tracing the faded pattern on her sleeves. Outside, the wind moaned its lonely song. The ranch was silent. She could leave. She could walk out the door right now, back into the dust, back to the unknown. The thought was terrifying, but the thought of staying, of belonging to Caleb Kane, was just as frightening in its own strange way. She looked around the bare little room. It was not a home. It was a hiding place. And for now, that was all she had. She lay back on the cot, pulling the thin gray blanket up to her chin. She did not run. For the first time in a very long time, she did not have the strength or the will to run. So she stayed. The words had settled in the dust between them, unspoken but unforgotten. "You belong to me now." In the days that followed, Caleb Kane did not speak them again. He did not, in fact, speak much at all. The silence that returned to the K-Bar-K ranch was heavier than before, filled with the weight of what he had seen and what he had said. He treated Lila no differently. He still ate alone, his dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the house. He still moved with a grim, relentless purpose, as if work were the only thing holding his bones together. But Lila felt a change. When his gaze passed over her, it was no longer with the detached assessment of a man inspecting a tool. There was a watchfulness there now, a stillness that made her feel seen in a way that was both terrifying and strangely grounding. Caleb Kane had not always been a man made of silence and stone. Years ago, before the fire had scorched his land and his heart, he had been known to laugh. His world had revolved around two things: this ranch, built with his own two hands, and a woman named Margaret, Mags. She had been the town's new school teacher, arriving from back east with a trunk full of books and a belief that she could plant knowledge in this hard country like a stubborn seed. She had hair the color of autumn leaves and a smile that could gentle a wild horse. Caleb, who had never had much use for books or soft words, found himself utterly undone by her. They were to be married in the spring. He had added a room to the ranch house for her, with a large window that faced the sunrise. He had even, in a fit of uncharacteristic sentimentality, planted a small garden of wildflowers near the porch. For a brief time, the K-Bar-K had known a woman's touch, and the future had seemed as wide and promising as the Montana sky. That future had ended in smoke and ash. A small band of drifters, men with nothing to lose and a thirst for cheap whiskey and chaos, had ridden through. They had tried to rob the general store, been run out of the saloon, and in a final act of pointless malice, they had set fire to the schoolhouse late one night. Margaret, who often worked late preparing her lessons, had been trapped inside. By the time Caleb saw the glow in the sky and rode like a madman into town, it was too late. The building was a roaring inferno. He had tried to go in after her, a futile, desperate act that left his back burned and his lungs full of smoke. The town men had to hold him back as the roof collapsed, taking Margaret and his world with it. He had buried what little was left of her under the lone cottonwood tree behind the barn. Then he had buried himself. He sold off half his herd, let two of his best hands go, and retreated into a fortress of work and silence. The fire had taken more than Margaret. It had burned away the softer parts of Caleb Kane, leaving behind only the hard, unyielding core. The drifters were never caught. They vanished into the vastness of the territory, a debt of vengeance that Caleb carried with him every single day, a cold, heavy stone in his gut. He had sworn no one would ever be that vulnerable on his land again. Lila knew nothing of this. She knew only the man he was now, and in the wake of his strange declaration, she found herself changing, too. It began in the kitchen. Her cooking, which had been purely functional, began to carry a whisper of intent. She had been cooking to survive. Now, she began to cook she was not sure what, to fill the silence. Perhaps, to prove her worth in the only way she knew how. She found a small patch of wild rosemary growing near the creek and began adding it to the beef stew. The scent filled the house, a sharp, clean fragrance that cut through the usual smells of leather and dust. She discovered a forgotten sack of dried apples in the root cellar and spent an afternoon painstakingly stewing them with cinnamon she found in a forgotten tin. That evening, there was a shallow apple tart on the table for the hands. They ate it with a kind of quiet reverence, their eyes wide with surprise. Caleb never said a word. He never complimented the food or acknowledged the extra effort. But Lila noticed things. He no longer left a single bean or scrap of meat on his plate. When she made sourdough biscuits, he would eat 3 instead of 2. One evening, after finishing a bowl of her rosemary stew, he sat at the table for a full minute after he was done, his fork resting on the empty plate, before he pushed his chair back and left. For Lila, these small, silent acknowledgments were more potent than a whole string of pretty words. They were real. About a month after her arrival, the supply trader came. His wagon, pulled by 2 weary-looking mules, creaked into the yard in a cloud of dust. He was a weaselly man named Elias, with shifty eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. The hands gathered around his wagon, eager for news from the outside world and the small luxuries he carried. Tins of peaches, hard candy, fresh tobacco. Lila stayed in the house, watching through the kitchen window. She had no money and no desire to speak to a stranger, but as Elias was packing up to leave, he glanced toward the house, and his eyes met hers. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a slow, unpleasant smile. Lila's blood ran cold. She stepped back from the window, her heart beginning to pound. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the back door. It was him. "Got a delivery for the cook," he said, his voice oily. He held up a small cloth sack of sugar. Lila took it, keeping her body behind the door. "Thank you." "No need to be shy," he said, leaning against the door frame, preventing her from closing it. His eyes roamed over her. "I know you. Took me a minute. Lila Thornton. Is not it? From up near Willow Creek." The name hit her like a physical blow. Thornton. The name of her cage. Her torment. "You are mistaken," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias chuckled, a low, nasty sound. "I do not think so. I remember that face. Remember hearing things, too. Husband is a powerful man. Mr. Thornton, a real cattle baron. Been looking high and low for some property that went missing. His pretty little wife, offering a handsome reward. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She could feel the blood draining from her face. "Please," she breathed. "Please, do not." His eyes narrowed, sensing his advantage. "Information has a price, ma'am, especially good information." Her mind raced. She had nothing. No money, no jewels, nothing of value. Then she remembered the hens. She had been gathering the eggs every morning. She had 2 dozen collected in a basket on the kitchen table. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling. She darted back into the kitchen, grabbed the basket, and brought it to him. "Take these. They are fresh. Please, say you never saw me." Elias looked at the basket of eggs, then back at her face. His lip curled in a sneer of contempt. He seemed to weigh the value of the eggs against the value of the reward. Finally, he shrugged and took the basket. "All right, Mrs. Thornton. I was never here, and I never saw you, but he will keep looking. A man like that always does." He gave her one last leering look and then sauntered back to his wagon, whistling a tuneless melody. Lila shut the door and leaned against it, her body shaking uncontrollably. "He'll be looking." The words were a death sentence. She had been a fool to think she could ever truly disappear. Her past had a long reach, and it was only a matter of time before it found her. That evening, Caleb seemed to sense the change in her. Her fear was a palpable thing, a scent in the air. He watched her as she served his dinner, her hands shaking so badly that the plate rattled. When he was done, he did not leave right away. He cleared his throat. "The hens are laying well," he said, his voice a low rumble. Lila jumped, startled that he had spoken to her. She could only nod. The coop needs cleaning. See to it in the morning. And check the fence line by the creek. A coyote got one of the birds last week. It was an order, nothing more, but it was also the first time he had given her a task that was not in the house. The next morning, she went out into the cool, clean air and collected the eggs. The simple, repetitive task was calming. Then she went to the creek, her eyes scanning the wire fence for breaks. The work was unfamiliar, but it was honest. It was about mending things. As she was twisting a piece of loose wire back into place, she glanced up at the ranch house. Caleb was on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, watching her. He did not wave. He just watched. A dark, silent figure ensuring the work was done, or ensuring she did not simply walk away. She was not sure which. He began giving her more small tasks outside, feeding the chickens, weeding the pathetic patch of earth that had once been a garden, holding a fence post steady while he hammered it into the ground. He never worked beside her. He would give her the task and then watch from a distance. She began to feel the sun on her skin, the wind in her hair. The world outside the kitchen walls was vast and dangerous, but it was also real, and under his distant, watchful eye, she began to feel a sliver of something she had not felt in years. Not safety, exactly, but something close to it, a feeling of being guarded. One evening, a raw wind blew down from the north, carrying the first real bite of winter. The hands finished their dinner and hurried to the warmth of the bunkhouse. Caleb, however, did not come in to eat. An hour passed, then another. A knot of unease tightened in Lila's stomach. She kept his dinner warm on the back of the stove, listening to the wind howl around the corners of the house. Finally, she pulled her thin shawl around her shoulders and slipped out the back door. The yard was dark, the moon hidden by a thick blanket of clouds. A single lantern cast a weak, flickering light from the open door of the barn. She moved toward it, her boots sinking into the soft dirt. She found him inside, sitting on an overturned bucket in the middle of the aisle. An empty whiskey bottle lay on the ground beside him. He was staring at the back wall of the barn, but Lila's eyes were drawn to the spot just outside the wide-open doors, to the lone cottonwood tree and the simple wooden cross that stood beneath it. He was drunk, not sloppy or loud, but quiet and heavy with it. He was talking, his voice a low, slurred murmur aimed at the grave. Would not have liked her, Mags, he was saying, his words thick. Too quiet, scared of her own shadow, like a kicked pup. He took a shaky breath. But she's not bad. Can cook a little, and she is clean. He fell silent for a moment, his broad shoulders slumping. Should have sent her on her way. No place for a woman here, not anymore. Lila stood in the shadows, her heart aching. For the woman under the tree, for this broken man talking to a ghost, and for herself, the kicked pup he should have sent away. She backed away as quietly as she could and fled to the house, the cold wind feeling no colder than the sorrow that had settled in the barn. The first snow came 2 nights later. It began as a harmless flurry, but by midnight, it was a raging blizzard. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow fell so thick and fast that the world beyond the windows disappeared into a swirling vortex of white. The hands were sealed in the bunkhouse. Lila and Caleb were sealed in the main house. The forced proximity was an awkward, suffocating thing. The house, which had seemed large enough, suddenly felt as small as a shoebox. Every creak of the floorboards, every breath, seemed magnified. They ate their meals in near total silence, the only sound the howl of the storm outside. Lila stayed in the kitchen as much as she could, and Caleb sat by the fire, sharpening knives or mending a piece of tack, his presence filling the small room. On the second day of the storm, the woodpile by the hearth ran low. Without a word, Caleb pulled on his boots and heavy coat and went outside. Lila watched from the window as he waded through the knee-deep snow to the woodpile near the barn. The wind tore at him, whipping his hair and coat. It was a brutal, punishing cold. He began to chop, the rhythmic, powerful swing of his axe the only steady thing in the chaos of the storm. After a few minutes, he shrugged out of his heavy coat, tossing it aside. Then, to Lila's astonishment, he pulled his wool shirt off over his head and threw it down as well. He worked on, stripped to the waist, his bare skin exposed to the biting wind and flying snow. Steam rose from his shoulders and back with every swing of the axe. It was a display of raw, stubborn strength, a man defying the very elements. Lila could not tear her eyes away, and that is when she saw them. The scars. His back was a road map of old injuries. A long, puckered white line ran from his left shoulder blade down to his ribs, the mark of a knife or something worse. But it was the other marks that made her gasp. A series of thin, criss-crossing white lines, faded with time but still clear against his skin. They were whip marks, old ones, but unmistakable. He carried his own brutal history on his skin just as she did. She did not think, she acted. She grabbed the heavy woolen blanket from his chair by the fire and, pulling her shawl tight, she opened the door and plunged into the storm. The wind and snow hit her with a physical force, stealing her breath. She struggled through the deep drifts, the blanket held tight against her chest. He did not see her until she was right behind him. He stopped, the axe held in mid-swing, and turned. His face was grim, his jaw tight against the cold. Snowflakes clung to his dark hair and eyelashes. He looked at her, then at the blanket, his expression unreadable. She did not speak. She could not. She simply stepped forward and, with trembling hands, she unfolded the blanket and wrapped it around his broad, bare shoulders. His skin was shockingly hot to the touch, radiating a fierce heat that fought the cold. For a moment, he stood rigid, his muscles tensed as if he expected a blow. His dark eyes bored into hers. She thought he might push her away, might yell at her for her foolishness. But he did not. He simply stood there, his chest rising and falling heavily, and allowed her to pull the rough wool tight around him. He said nothing. He did not move. He just let her. The moment stretched on, a silent eternity in the heart of the storm. Then, slowly, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Lila backed away and stumbled back to the house, her heart pounding. That night, long after the house had fallen silent save for the moaning of the wind, she lay in her narrow cot and cried. They were quiet, hot tears that soaked her pillow. She did not know why she was crying. Was it for the ghost of a woman named Mags? For the broken man with the scarred back? A man who fought the cold as if it were a personal enemy? Or was it for herself? For the unexpected, terrifying crack of warmth she had felt when he had let her cover him, when he had let her, for a single moment, offer comfort instead of just receiving a threat? She did not know. She only knew that something inside her, something she had thought long dead and buried, was painfully, strangely, beginning to stir. The thaw was a liar. It came in brief, deceptive spells, when the winter sun would shine with a weak, watery light, melting the top layer of snow into slush and mud. It offered a false promise of spring, a hope that the long, cold siege was ending. But then the iron-gray clouds would roll in from the north again. The temperature would plummet, and the land would once more be locked in a grip of ice. It was on one of these false spring days that the stranger came. Lila saw him first from the kitchen window. He was a long way off, a single dark rider moving steadily across the vast, white plain. Men on horseback were not an unusual sight, but this one was different. He rode not with the easy, slouching posture of a cowboy, but with a stiff, straight-backed authority. He was not following the faint track that led to the ranch. He was cutting a direct line, as if the land itself were obligated to bend to his will. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. She watched as he grew closer, her hand clutching the edge of the sink. He wore a long, dark coat, and the horse he rode was a powerful black gelding, a stark shape against the snow. He looked official. He looked like the law. Caleb had seen him, too. By the time the rider reached the yard, Caleb was standing on the porch, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of weathered stone. He had appeared from the barn as silently as a shadow, a rifle held loosely in one hand, its barrel pointing toward the ground. The stranger reined his horse to a halt a few feet from the porch. He was a big man, with a square jaw and pale, cold eyes that missed nothing. A silver star was pinned to his coat, glinting dully in the weak sunlight. A United States Marshal. The sight of it made Lila's breath catch in her throat. "Caleb Kane?" the Marshal asked. His voice was deep and carried the weight of authority. Caleb gave a short, hard nod. "That is me, Marshal John Bridges," the man said, swinging down from his horse. His movements were efficient and sure. "I am looking for a woman. Goes by the name of Lila Thornton. About so high, brown hair, brown eyes. Folks said she might have headed this way." Lila pressed herself back into the shadows of the kitchen, her body rigid with terror. Thornton. He had said the name she had tried to shed like a snake's skin. The world seemed to shrink until it was nothing but the sound of the Marshal's voice and the frantic, trapped beating of her own heart. Caleb did not move. He did not blink. He listened to the description, his expression unchanging. The silence stretched out, taut and thin. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the house and the soft stamp of the Marshal's horse. "Why are you looking for?" Caleb's voice was flat, devoid of curiosity. Marshal Bridges pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Warrant for her arrest. Issued out of Willow Creek County. Theft of property from her husband, Mr. Marcus Thornton. And there is a question of murder. A farmhand who worked for Thornton turned up dead right around the time she disappeared. Stabbed. Murder." The word was a physical blow. Lila felt her knees go weak, and she leaned against the wall for support. Samuel, kind, gentle Samuel, who had only tried to help her. They had twisted his death into a weapon to be used against her. Her husband's reach was even longer and more venomous than she had imagined. On the porch, Caleb's gaze remained steady on the Marshal. He seemed to be considering the words, weighing them. Lila held her breath, waiting for the betrayal. For the moment he would nod and say, "Yes, she is here. Take her." It would be the smart thing to do. The safe thing. Harboring a fugitive, an accused murderer, was a hanging offense. "Never heard the name," Caleb said. The lie was so bald, so absolute. It was more shocking than the truth would have been. He delivered it with no hesitation, no flicker of deception in his dark eyes. It was a simple statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the man who spoke it. Marshal Bridges studied him for a long moment, his cold eyes searching Caleb's face for any sign of a lie. Caleb met his gaze without flinching. "Just me and my hands out here," Caleb continued, his voice still flat. "Ain't had a woman on this ranch in years, not since my fiancé died." The mention of his dead fiancé was a masterstroke. It was a truth so profound and painful that it acted as a shield for the lie. The Marshal's hard expression softened for a fraction of a second. He had heard the stories, clearly. The man who hated women. The man with ghosts. "I see," Bridges said, his tone shifting slightly. He folded the warrant and put it back in his pocket. "Well, if you see or hear of anyone matching that description, you send word to the sheriff in Redemption." "If I see her, I will," Caleb said, the lie compounding itself. The Marshal nodded, then turned and swung himself back into the saddle. He gave the ranch house one last, sweeping look, his eyes lingering for a moment on the kitchen window where Lila hid in the shadows. Then he turned his horse and rode away, his straight back a receding line of dark judgment against the snow. Caleb stood on the porch and watched until the marshal was just a small, dark speck on the horizon. Only then did he turn, the rifle still in his hand, and come back into the house. He shut the door behind him, the sound echoing in the silent room. He did not look at Lila. He walked to the fireplace, leaned the rifle against the stone hearth, and began to build up the fire, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Lila remained frozen in the kitchen doorway, her body trembling with the aftermath of her terror. He had lied for her. He had put himself between her and the law. He had stood on that porch and risked everything for a woman he barely knew, a woman who was nothing more than his hired cook. The magnitude of it was too much to comprehend. He did not speak to her for the rest of the day. The silence was a living thing, a palpable presence in the house. He ate his dinner that evening in the same grim quiet as always, but Lila could feel him watching her. She knew the confrontation was coming. He had bought her time, but the bill would come due. It came after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was shrouded in the deep, velvet dark of a country night. She was in the kitchen, scrubbing a cast-iron skillet with a ferocity born of nervous energy. She heard his boots on the floorboards behind her. He did not stop in the main room. He came all the way into the kitchen and stood there, blocking the only way out. She kept her back to him, her knuckles white as she gripped the skillet. "Lila Thornton," he said. It was not a question. She flinched, the name sounding like a curse in the quiet room. Slowly, she turned to face him. He was a large shadow in the dim lamplight, his face obscured, his presence overwhelming. "He said murder," Caleb stated, his voice a low rumble. The tears she had been holding back all day finally came. They spilled over and ran down her cheeks, hot and shameful. "No," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. "It was not me. I did not kill anyone." "Then start talking," he commanded. His tone was not angry. It was hard, impatient. He was a man who dealt in facts, and he had just lied to a U.S. Marshal. He needed the facts. And so she told him. The words came out in a broken, stumbling rush, a torrent of misery and fear that had been dammed up inside her for years. She told him about Marcus Thornton, her husband, a wealthy man, respected in his county, with a smile for the world and a fist for his wife. She told him of the beatings, the quiet, methodical cruelty that took place behind the locked doors of their fine house while the town looked the other way. She told him how he saw her as a piece of property, a beautiful possession to be displayed and disciplined as he saw fit. She told him about the theft charge. She had taken one of her own horses to escape, and a small purse of money her own father had given her as a wedding gift. In her husband's eyes, and in the eyes of the law he owned, the horse and the money, like her, belonged to him. Finally, she told him about Samuel, a young man, barely a boy, who had worked on a neighboring ranch and had seen the Bruises. He had taken pity on her. He had helped her plan her escape, promising to meet her with a fresh horse miles from town. But her husband had found out. He had cornered Samuel in the stables. There had been a fight. Samuel had pulled a hay hook to defend himself. In the struggle, Marcus had turned it back on him. It was Marcus who had killed him. But Marcus was rich, and Samuel was a nobody. It was easy to pay a few men to swear they saw Lila running from the stables, a bloody knife in her hand. Easy to turn his victim into his pursuer. She finished her story and stood there, weeping silently in the dim light, stripped bare of all her secrets. She waited for his judgment, for the disgust, for the order to get out of his house. Caleb was silent for a long time. He stood there, a great, unmoving shadow, and listened to the last of her shuddering breaths. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like gravel scraping against stone. "You should have killed him," he said. Lila looked up, stunned. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not one of them. There was no pity in his voice, no condemnation, just a cold, hard statement of what he believed to be the truth. In his world, You met violence with greater violence. You did not run. You finished the fight. And in that one brutal sentence, he told her that he believed her. More than that, he understood the world she had come from, a world where the only justice was the kind you made for yourself. A fragile, tentative thing began to form between them in the days that followed. It was not friendship, and it was certainly not softness. It was a kind of trust, born not of affection, but of shared hardship. He had seen the worst of her past, and he had not turned away. She had seen the sorrow in him, the ghosts he lived with. They were two solitary, wounded creatures who had found themselves sharing the same patch of desolate ground. The routine of the ranch continued, but the atmosphere inside the house shifted. The silence was no longer a tense, watchful thing. It became a comfortable space they could both inhabit. She would cook, and instead of retreating to the fireplace, he would sit at the long table, cleaning his rifle or mending a bridle, the scent of gun oil and leather mingling with the smell of baking bread. They rarely spoke, but she was no longer afraid of his presence. She would find herself humming quietly as she worked, a thing she had not done in years, and sometimes she would look up and find him watching her, his expression still grim, but without the hard, dismissive edge it once had. They breathed the same air, and for the first time, it did not feel like she was stealing it. Winter, however, was not yet done with them. Another blizzard rolled in, even more ferocious than the last. It struck without warning, a wall of white that descended on the plains and swallowed the world. Once again, they were trapped. The howling of the wind a constant, maddening scream. On the second night of the storm, as Lila was banking the fire in the hearth for the night, a tremendous crash echoed through the house. It was a sound of splintering wood and falling stone, followed by a roar as the wind found a new way into the house. A loose piece of the chimney, weakened by years of wind and ice, had broken free and crashed onto the roof. For Caleb, it was a nuisance. For Lila, it was a trigger. The sudden, violent noise ripped through the quiet of the house and straight through her defenses. It was the sound of a door being kicked in, the sound of a heavy table being overturned, the sound of a fist hitting a wall. Her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. A primal, mindless terror seized her. She screamed, a thin, animal sound. Her body reacted before her mind could. She scrambled away from the fireplace, away from the noise, and curled herself into the darkest corner of the room, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around her head. She made herself as small as possible, a tactic learned through years of trying to make herself a smaller target. She was no longer in Caleb Kane's ranch house. She was back in another room, in another life, waiting for the blows to fall. Her body shook with violent, uncontrollable tremors. Sobs tore from her throat, raw and ragged. Caleb found her there a moment later. He came around the table, the lantern held high, its light casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. He saw her huddled in the corner, a small, shaking bundle of terror. His first instinct, the one that had governed him for years, was to be harsh, to tell her to get up, to stop her caterwauling. But he stopped. He saw not his cook, not the woman Lila, but the embodiment of pure, unreasoning fear. He saw the kicked pup he had once described to a ghost. He set the lantern down on the table and approached her slowly. He knelt, not too close, bringing his large frame down to her level. "It is just the wind," he said, his voice low and steady. "A piece of the chimney came loose, that is all." She did not seem to hear him. She just kept shaking, her face buried in her arms. He reached out a hand, then hesitated. He was not a man accustomed to offering comfort. His hands were hard, calloused things, made for roping cattle and fixing fences. Not for gentleness, but he had to do something. He reached out again, and this time, he did not hesitate. He placed his hand on her shoulder. She flinched violently at his touch, a choked cry escaping her lips. But he did not pull away. He simply kept his hand there, his grip firm, steady, and warm. It was not a rough touch. It was an anchor, a solid, unmoving point in the swirling chaos of her panic. Slowly, the violent shaking began to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering tremor. She risked a look up at him through her tear-soaked hair. In the dim lamplight, his face was all harsh angles and shadows, but his eyes were fixed on her, and in them, she saw a flicker of something she could not have named. "Do not let him find me," she whispered, the words a raw, desperate plea. It was not the marshal she was afraid of in that moment. It was her husband, the monster from her past. Caleb's expression hardened. His grip on her shoulder tightened. Just for a second. "He will not," he said. The words were not a comfort. They were a vow, a promise made of iron and rock. "He will not." He stayed there, kneeling on the floor, his hand on her shoulder, until the last of the tremors had passed and her breathing had evened out. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white. The first thing Caleb did was climb onto the roof to inspect the damage to the chimney. The second thing he did was walk to the barn. He returned not with tools to fix the chimney, but with a hammer and a handful of long, thick iron spikes. He went to the front door and, with a series of powerful, rhythmic blows, he hammered 2 of the spikes into the heavy wooden frame, creating a makeshift but brutally effective deadbolt. He did the same to the back door in the kitchen. Then he went to the gun rack by the fireplace. His familiar rifle was there. He reached into a dusty crate beside the hearth and pulled out a second rifle, a smaller Winchester, lighter and with less of a kick. He spent an hour cleaning and oiling it at the table while Lila watched, her heart thudding in her chest. When he was finished, he stood up and held the rifle out to her. "You need to learn how to use this," he said. His voice was flat, practical. "I am not always in the house." Lila stared at the gun. It was a cold, deadly thing. She had never held one in her life. The very idea of it terrified her. I cannot," she stammered. "You can," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will." He took her out behind the barn, away from the sight of the house. He set up an old tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. Then he stood behind her and showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace its stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long, steel barrel. His hands were on hers, guiding her, their touch impersonal, instructive. His body was close behind hers, shielding her from the wind, his low voice a constant rumble in her ear as he explained the mechanics of the weapon. "Breathe out," he commanded. "Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." She closed her eyes and did as he said. The rifle exploded against her shoulder, a deafening roar that made her cry out. The recoil was a hard, shocking punch that sent her stumbling back against him. The tin can on the fence post remained untouched. She was shaking, her eyes wide with fear and the shock of the noise. She wanted to drop the gun and run. "Again," Caleb said, his voice implacable. They stayed out there for over an hour, until her shoulder was sore and her ears were ringing. She missed more times than she hit, but by the end, she was able to hold the rifle steady, to fire it without flinching away, and she even managed to knock the can off the post twice. When they were done, he took the rifle from her and led her back to the house. He did not praise her. He did not say she had done a good job. He simply hung the second rifle on the rack next to his own. The 2 guns, hanging there side by side, were a silent statement. This house was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress. And she was no longer just its cook. She was part of its defense. The world thawed. It happened not in a great rush, but in a slow, deliberate surrender. The iron fist of winter loosened its grip finger by finger, letting the frozen earth breathe again. Water, once locked in silent, solid sheets, began to trickle and then to run, its voice a soft murmur that promised life. The biting wind that had howled like a starved wolf for months softened into a gentle sigh, carrying not the scent of ice but the rich, dark aroma of damp soil and awakening roots. Patches of stubborn snow retreated into the shadows of the pines, shrinking daily until they were nothing more than memories against the burgeoning green of new grass. For Lila, the change was more than seasonal. It was a thawing within her own soul. The fear that had kept her huddled by the hearth, a prisoner in the sturdy cabin that had been her salvation, began to recede with the snow. She found herself watching the light linger longer each evening, feeling not a sense of dread for the approaching night, but a quiet satisfaction in a day well spent. The sound of Caleb's axe splitting firewood was no longer just a reminder of their isolation, but a steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the life they were building, however temporary, however fragile. The fence line along the northern pasture had suffered under the weight of the winter's heavy drifts. Several posts had loosened in the softening ground, and a long section of rail had snapped clean in two. When Caleb had announced his intention to spend the day mending it, Lila had not hesitated. "I will help," she had said, her voice clear and firm, leaving no room for argument. He had looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. He saw not the haunted, trembling woman he had pulled from the snow, but someone with a new resolve in the set of her jaw and a quiet light in her eyes. He nodded once, a gesture that was both acceptance and acknowledgement. Now, under the pale but warming sun, she worked beside him. The heavy wool shawls and cloaks of winter were gone, packed away in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She wore a simple calico dress, its fabric worn soft with washing, and for the first time since she had arrived, she rolled the sleeves up to her elbows, exposing her forearms to the cool air. The skin was pale, almost translucent, but the simple act felt like a declaration of freedom. She held the new pine rail steady while Caleb drove the spikes, the rhythmic thud of his hammer echoing across the valley. She did not flinch from the noise or the exertion. Her hands, though unaccustomed to such labor, were steady. Caleb worked with an efficient economy of motion, his powerful shoulders bunching and releasing with each swing. Yet, he was acutely aware of her presence beside him. He watched her from the corner of his eye, noting the way she bit her lower lip in concentration, the stray strands of auburn hair that escaped her bun to curl against her neck, the surprising strength in her slender arms as she braced the heavy wood. He saw the faint freckles that the sun was beginning to coax across the bridge of her nose. He had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of their life inside the cabin, the shared meals, the silent evenings reading by the fire. But seeing her out here, in the open air, a partner in his work, stirred something deeper within him. It was a feeling he did not trust himself to name, a dangerous and unfamiliar warmth that spread through his chest. He maintained his respectful distance, his words few and focused only on the task at hand. But his silence was no longer born of grim necessity. It was a silence of contemplation, of watching, of a profound and growing tenderness. One afternoon, as the last of the mending was being done, the sound of an approaching wagon broke the peaceful quiet. It was a rare enough occurrence to make them both pause, their hands stilling on the rough-hewn wood. A portly man with a florid face and a booming voice reined in a pair of handsome bays, waving a hand in greeting. "Caleb, my boy," the man bellowed. "Good to see you have not been swallowed whole by the winter." "Mr. Denton," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. He did not move from his position by the fence, his body a solid, unreadable wall. The man, Arthur Denton, owned the neighboring ranch, a sprawling and prosperous operation that dwarfed Caleb's modest homestead. He was a man who enjoyed his station in the county, a purveyor of gossip and a self-appointed pillar of the community. His eyes slid from Caleb to Lila, a flicker of undisguised curiosity in them. "And this must be the young lady your man Elias mentioned," Denton said, his tone avuncular but his gaze sharp. "The one you took in during the storm. A true Christian act, Caleb, a true Christian act." Lila felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, and she looked down, suddenly conscious of the dirt on her hands and the wayward strands of her hair. "This is Miss Lila," Caleb stated flatly, offering no surname, no explanation. Denton tipped his hat. "A pleasure. Miss, we are having a small gathering at our place come Sunday. A picnic to celebrate the spring. Nothing fancy, just some neighbors and good food. The wife would be delighted if you both would join us." The invitation hung in the air, a stark and unexpected intrusion into their secluded world. Lila's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The thought of being among people, of facing their questions and their stares, was terrifying. It was the very thing she had been hiding from. She instinctively looked to Caleb, her eyes wide with a silent plea. Caleb's expression was hard as granite. He was about to refuse, the word already forming on his lips. But he saw the conflict in her face. He saw the fear. Yes, but beneath it, he saw a flicker of something else, a longing, a yearning for the simple, ordinary things she had lost. To be among other women, to hear the laughter of children, to sit in the sun and be a part of the world again. To deny her that, to keep her locked away for his own comfort and peace of mind, suddenly felt like the cruelest form of imprisonment. "We will see, Denton," Caleb said, his voice non-committal. "Excellent," Denton boomed, choosing to take it as an acceptance. "The wife is roasting a pig. We will expect you around noon." With another tip of his hat, he clucked to his horses and the wagon rumbled away, leaving a cloud of dust and a profound silence in its wake. Lila did not speak for a long time. Caleb finished securing the last rail, his movements precise and deliberate. "You do not have to go," he said finally, not looking at her. She traced the grain of the wood with her fingertip. "What will they think?" she whispered. "Of me being here, with you?" "I do not give a damn what they think," he said, his voice rough. "And neither should you." She looked up at him then, at his stern profile against the wide blue sky. He was right. Hiding forever was not living. It was merely surviving, and she was tired of just surviving. "I would like to go," she said, her voice barely audible, but firm. A muscle tightened in Caleb's jaw, but he only nodded. "Then we will go." Sunday arrived bright and clear, one of those perfect spring days that felt like a gift. Lila had spent the previous day washing and pressing her best dress, a simple gown of dark blue wool that was modest and plain. She braided her hair with meticulous care, her fingers trembling slightly. Standing before the small mirror in her room, she saw a stranger looking back at her. The woman in the glass was pale and thin, with shadows still lurking in the depths of her eyes. But there was a spark of determination there that had been absent for so long. Caleb was waiting for her by the wagon, his own appearance startlingly different. He had shaved, the sharp line of his jaw exposed and clean. He wore a dark coat and a white shirt, starched and buttoned to the collar. He looked taller, somehow, and more imposing than he did in his daily work clothes. He looked like a stranger, too. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand firm and warm at her elbow, the brief contact sending a jolt through her. The ride to the Denton ranch was mostly silent. The landscape, vibrant with new life, passed by in a blur. Lila's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Caleb seemed to sense her turmoil. "If it becomes too much," he said, his eyes on the road ahead, "you just tell me. We will leave." She gave him a small, grateful nod. The Denton ranch was a hive of activity. Dozens of people were spread across the expansive lawn, mingling on quilts laid out on the grass. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, the high-pitched squeals of children playing tag, and the savory smell of roasting pork. It was a scene of such wholesome, boisterous community that it made Lila's throat ache with a sense of loss. Mrs. Denton, a bustling, good-natured woman with a kind smile, greeted them warmly and immediately drew Lila into a circle of other women. They were polite, asking after her health and commenting on the fine weather. But Lila felt their curious eyes on her, assessing her, speculating. She answered their questions in a quiet, reserved voice, offering vague pleasantries and revealing nothing of substance. She felt as though she were playing a part, a woman with no past and an uncertain future. Caleb, meanwhile, was drawn into a group of men discussing cattle prices and rainfall. He stood at the edge of the circle, a formidable, silent presence. He drank the lemonade he was offered and said little, his gaze constantly drifting back to where Lila stood, making sure she was all right. An hour passed, and Lila began to relax. The kindness of Mrs. Denton and the innocent antics of the children began to soothe her frayed nerves. Perhaps this was possible. Perhaps she could find a place in this world again. She was helping to set out a bowl of potato salad on one of the long trestle tables when a man she had noticed earlier approached her. He was one of Denton's hired hands, a lanky man with slicked back hair and an insolent smirk. He had been watching her since she arrived, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well now," he said, his voice a low drawl meant for her ears only. "Look what the storm blew in. Caleb sure got himself a pretty little secret tucked away up in those hills." Lila stiffened, her hand freezing above the bowl. She tried to ignore him, turning her back slightly. He was not deterred. He moved closer, his voice dropping lower, thick with insinuation. "Must get lonely up there for a woman like you. A man like him, well, he has certain needs. I reckon you are good at keeping him warm through the winter nights." The words were a physical blow, ugly and violating. They stripped away the fragile peace she had found and plunged her back into the filth of her past. All the blood seemed to rush from her head. She felt dizzy, sickened. She could not speak, could not move. She did not have to. A shadow fell over them. Caleb had moved with a speed that was terrifying in its silence. One moment he was across the lawn. The next he was there, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury. He did not say a word. His hand shot out and clamped onto the front of the hired man's shirt. Twisting the fabric tight, he lifted the man, who was not small, half off his feet as if he weighed nothing. The man's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned fear. "Hey now, Caleb," he stammered, his hands coming up in a placating gesture. "Just making conversation." Caleb's eyes were chips of ice. He propelled the man backwards, his boots stumbling to keep up. The crowd, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere, fell silent. Laughter died. Conversations halted. All eyes turned to the unfolding drama. Caleb did not stop until he reached the large wooden trough used for watering the horses. With a final, contemptuous shove, he threw the man into the cold, murky water. There was a great splash, followed by a collective gasp from the crowd. The hired hand came up sputtering and coughing, his slicked back hair now plastered to his face, his clothes soaked and clinging to his frame. He scrambled out of the trough, shivering and humiliated, and scurried away without a backward glance. The silence that followed was thick with judgment. Caleb stood over the trough, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked like a predator, dangerous and untamed. The whispers started almost immediately, a low hiss that spread through the crowd like fire in dry grass. "Did you see that? Near killed him?" Always knew he had a mean streak. "He is possessive. That one. He has claimed her now, plain as day. That poor girl. No woman is safe with him." Lila heard it all. She saw the fear and condemnation in their eyes. They were not looking at her with pity now, but with a kind of morbid fascination. She was his property, a thing to be fought over. Denton rushed forward, his face apoplectic, but one look at Caleb's expression stopped him cold. Caleb turned, his gaze sweeping over the silent, staring faces until it found Lila. He walked to her, his movement stiff and deliberate, and took her by the arm. His grip was not rough, but it was unyielding. "We are leaving," he said, his voice low and raw. He led her through the stunned crowd, who parted for them as if he were a leper. He lifted her into the wagon and climbed up beside her, taking the reins without a word. They rode away from the Denton ranch, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind them. The journey back to the cabin was suffocating in its silence. Lila sat rigidly on the wagon seat, staring at her hands, the hired man's vile words and the crowd's condemning whispers replaying over and over in her mind. Caleb's profile was carved from stone, his jaw set, his knuckles white on the reins. The beautiful spring day now seemed mocking, its brightness an affront to the ugliness that had transpired. She had been a fool to think she could ever be normal again. She was tainted, and now, by his actions, so was he. They reached the cabin as dusk was beginning to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. Caleb unhitched the horse with brutally efficient movements while Lila went inside, the familiar space of the cabin feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. She stood in the middle of the room, arms wrapped around herself, shivering despite the warmth from the banked embers in the fireplace. Caleb entered, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. He did not light the lamps, leaving them in the growing twilight. He moved to the hearth and added a log to the fire, coaxing the embers back to life with a poker. The flames caught, casting flickering shadows across the room, across his grim, unreadable face. Finally, she could bear the silence no longer. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice a thin thread in the quiet room. "Defending me?" He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. The firelight carved deep hollows under his cheekbones and glittered in his dark eyes. His expression was tormented. "Regret it," he said, his voice guttural, laced with a pain she did not understand. "Lila, I would kill any man who touches you wrong. I would do it without a second's thought, and I would not lose a moment of sleep over it." The ferocity of his words stole her breath. This was not just about honor. It was something deeper, something primal and fiercely protective that went far beyond mere chivalry. It frightened her, and yet it was the safest she had ever felt. She took a hesitant step closer. "He was right about one thing," she said softly. Caleb's body went rigid. "What?" "You touch me," she whispered, her gaze locked with his. "But you touch me different." She saw the raw emotion that flooded his eyes. Surprise, confusion, a desperate, aching hope. The space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words, with months of shared silence and solitude, with the terrible and beautiful intimacy of their strange existence. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He raised a hand, his calloused, work-roughened fingers trembling slightly as they came up to cup her jaw. His touch was so gentle it was almost reverent. He searched her eyes, looking for a sign, for permission, for a truth he was terrified to misread. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was a surrender and an invitation all at once. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but one of profound hesitation. It was slow, tentative, a question asked in the softest of languages. His lips were chapped and firm, and they tasted of the cool evening air and a deep, lonely sorrow. She responded with equal caution, her own lips parting slightly, a silent answer to his question. It was a kiss that spoke of shared pain and the fragile possibility of healing, a quiet acknowledgement of the chasm of their pasts and the single, narrow bridge they had found in each other. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. His breathing was unsteady. "Lila?" He breathed her name like a prayer. "I am not a good man. There is a darkness in me you cannot understand." His voice was thick with self-loathing. "But I swear to you, I will be good to you. I will." She believed him. In that moment, with the firelight dancing around them and the vast, lonely wilderness outside, She believed him with every broken piece of her heart. That night, for the first time, she did not go to her own small room. After the fire had burned down to glowing coals and the cabin was filled with a deep, quiet dark, she followed him to his. There was a desperate, unspoken need between them, a desire not just for physical closeness, but for a profound and absolute obliteration of the loneliness that had defined both their lives. Their coming together was not the seamless, graceful union of stories. It was clumsy and raw. Fraught with the ghosts they both carried, their passion was real, a fierce, hungry thing. But it was imperfect. At a sudden movement, a touch that came too quickly, she would flinch, her body instinctively recoiling from a memory he could not see. And when she did, he would freeze, his own demons rising up to accuse him, the fear of causing her more pain paralyzing him completely. But they did not turn away from each other. In the quiet darkness, they learned. He learned to move with a deliberate slowness, to read the language of her body, to anticipate the shadows that haunted her. He learned to soothe her with his voice, murmuring her name, telling her she was safe, that he would not hurt her. She learned the rigid control he held over his own strength, the tremor in his hands that betrayed his fear of his own power. She learned to trace the scars on his back with her fingertips, to feel the tension in his shoulders, and to understand that his wounds were as deep as her own, just of a different kind. It was a slow, painful, and beautiful education. They were two damaged souls learning to fit their broken edges together, not to become whole again, but to create something new, something strong enough to stand against the world. In the shared vulnerability of those nights, they began to build a trust that was more profound than any spoken vow, a fragile intimacy forged not in perfection, but in the shared, courageous act of learning to be touched again. The fragile peace of their existence was shattered by the arrival of 4 riders. They appeared at the crest of the hill in the late afternoon, their forms stark silhouettes against the brilliant, uncaring blue of the sky. They did not approach like neighbors or lost travelers. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that spoke of ownership and absolute certainty. Lila was drawing water from the well when she saw them, and the bucket slipped from her numb fingers, crashing against the stones with a hollow clang that echoed the sudden emptiness in her chest. She knew, before they were close enough to see their faces, a cold dread, ancient and familiar, coiled in her stomach. She knew. Caleb came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw the direction of her terrified gaze, and his body went still, his posture shifting from that of a rancher at rest to a wolf scenting danger. He moved to stand in front of her, a solid and unbreachable wall. His eyes narrowed on the approaching men. The man at the lead was Silas Croft. He was just as Lila remembered him, impeccably dressed even after a long ride, his fine leather coat unblemished by dust, his handsome face marred by an expression of innate arrogance. He was a man accustomed to the world bending to his will, a cattle baron whose wealth had bought him influence, power, and the convenient illusion of righteousness. Beside him rode 2 men with tin stars pinned to their vests, their faces hard and impassive. They were not lawmen, they were enforcers, their authority purchased by the man who held their leash. A 4th man, a hired gun with cold, watchful eyes, lagged slightly behind. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from the cabin, the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves on dirt, the only sounds in the tense silence. Silas Croft's eyes swept over the homestead with a dismissive air before they landed on Lila, cowering behind Caleb. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "Well, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, carrying easily in the still air. "It appears your little adventure has come to an end. You have caused a great deal of trouble. Elspeth." He used her given name, a name she had not heard in months, and it felt like a brand being pressed into her skin. She flinched, but she did not run. She held her ground, her hands clutching the back of Caleb's shirt. Caleb did not turn his head. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble, like stones grinding together. Her name is Lila, and she is not going anywhere. Silas raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. I am afraid you are mistaken. I have a legal writ here from the circuit judge. He produced a folded document from his coat pocket, holding it up as if it were a royal decree. It recognizes my right and duty to reclaim my wife, who, in a state of feminine hysterics, absconded from my care. These marshals are here to see the judge's order is carried out peacefully. Those are not marshals, Caleb said, his voice flat. And that piece of paper is worthless here. Brave words from a dirt scratcher with a half-wild homestead? Silas sneered, his gaze flicking to Caleb with contempt. I am her husband. She is my property, by the laws of God and man. You are harboring a runaway. That is a crime. Now, step aside before this becomes unpleasant. You will have to kill me first, Caleb said. There was no bravado in his tone, only a simple statement of fact. The two hired marshals exchanged a look, their hands drifting instinctively toward the pistols at their hips. The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. Lila could feel the tremors of rage running through Caleb's body. A terrifying, contained power. Silas Croft's smile tightened. He had not expected such direct opposition. He was a man who used threats and the weight of his station, not brute force. You are making a fatal error. I am a patient man, but my patience has its limits. We will be back, and when we return, this will be settled. Elspeth, he said, his voice hardening as he looked directly at her. You would do well to remember your vows. You belong to me. With that, he wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. They rode away at the same deliberate pace, their departure a threat, not a retreat. They left behind a silence that was more terrifying than their presence. The sun began to set, bleeding color across the horizon, but neither of them noticed. Lila was shaking so violently she could barely stand. Caleb turned and gripped her shoulders, his hold firm, steadying her. Go inside, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Bar the door. That night, the cabin felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind in the pines, sounded like the approach of Silas's men. They ate their supper in silence, the food tasteless in their mouths. Elias, Caleb's grizzled and loyal ranch hand, had come up from his bunkhouse, his face grim. He had seen the riders. He sat at the table with them, a shotgun resting across his lap, his presence a quiet statement of allegiance. After Elias had returned to the bunkhouse to stand watch, Caleb finally spoke. He stood before the fireplace, the low flames casting his face in shadow. You have to go, he said, his back to her. Tonight, take the gray mare. She is the fastest. Ride north. Do not stop until you reach the territories. You can make a new life there, where he cannot find you. Lila stared at his rigid back. Run again, hide again, spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. The thought was a cold, dead weight in her soul. She thought of the woman who had stumbled through the snow, half dead and wholly terrified. She was not that woman anymore. This cabin, this man, this harsh and beautiful land had changed her. And what will you do? She asked, her voice quiet but steady. I will stay, he said. This is my land. I will not be run off it. I will delay them, give you time. He turned to face her then, and she saw the raw agony in his eyes. He was prepared to die for her, to buy her freedom with his own life. She walked toward him until she was standing directly in front of him. So close, she could see the flicker of the fire reflected in his dark pupils. She remembered the whispers at the picnic, the words that had once seemed like a condemnation. He has claimed her. She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. After the picnic, she said softly, when the people were whispering, I heard what they said about you. A muscle in his jaw tightened. They do not know anything. They said you had claimed me, she continued, her voice unwavering. "That I belong to you." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "You told me you would be good to me. You have been. You told me you would kill any man who touched me wrong. You meant it, so if I belong to you, then I do not run. If this is your land, then it is my land. I stay." The words hung between them, a vow more sacred than any she had spoken in a church. He stared at her, his throat working, his face a mask of disbelief and a profound, heart-wrenching tenderness. He had offered her escape, and she had chosen him. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest, his face buried in her hair. He held her not with passion, but with a desperate, grateful strength, as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. He did not speak, but she felt his answer in the fierce, protective circle of his arms. She was staying. The next day was a blur of grim preparation. There was no pretense, no hope that Silas would not return. It was not a matter of if, but when. Caleb and Elias worked with a grim, silent efficiency that spoke of past conflicts and hard-won survival. They boarded up the lower half of the cabin's windows, leaving only narrow slits for sighting a rifle. They rigged a tripwire of thin twine and empty tin cans along the main approach to the cabin, a crude but effective alarm. They brought the livestock into the barn, securing the heavy doors with a thick wooden beam. The cabin was transformed from a home into a fortress. The air grew thick with the smell of gun oil and nervous sweat. Caleb brought out his arsenal, a heavy buffalo rifle, 2 repeating rifles, and his own Colt revolver. He handed one of the rifles to Lila. It was heavy in her hands, the wood smooth and cold, the metal smelling of death. Her fingers trembled as she wrapped them around the stock. "Have you ever fired a gun?" he asked, his voice low and patient. "No," she whispered. He showed her how to load it, how to work the lever action, how to sight down the long barrel. His hands were steady over hers, guiding her, his instructions clear and concise. "You do not fire unless they are inside the cabin," he told her, his eyes boring into hers. "You find a corner, you make yourself small, and you do not stop pulling the trigger until the gun is empty. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. This was the reality of her choice. To stay meant to fight meant to kill. The woman who had flinched at the sound of a falling log was now holding a weapon, preparing to take a human life. She was terrified, but a cold resolve settled over her fear. She would not be a victim. Not again. They did not have to wait long. They came just after dawn the next morning, riding out of the mist like specters of judgment. Silas was there, but he stayed back, a general observing from a safe distance. It was his 3 hired guns who dismounted, rifles in hand, and began to advance on the cabin. The first warning was the frantic, tinny clatter of the cans on the tripwire. It was a jarring, ugly sound in the morning quiet. It was followed instantly by the crack of Caleb's buffalo rifle from an upstairs window. One of the men screamed and fell, clutching his leg. The other 2 scattered, diving for the cover of the rocks and trees that dotted the landscape. The world erupted into a cacophony of gunfire. Bullets thudded into the log walls of the cabin, sending splinters of wood flying. Elias, positioned at a window on the ground floor, answered with his shotgun. The blast a deafening roar that filled the small space. Lila huddled in a corner as Caleb had instructed, her rifle clutched to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. She could hear Caleb moving upstairs, firing, reloading, his movements economical and deadly. The siege stretched on. The sun climbed higher, and the cabin grew hot and filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. One of the men tried to make a run for the barn. Elias' shotgun roared again, but the man was fast. He disappeared behind the large wooden structure. "He is in the barn!" Elias yelled. "Stay here," Caleb shouted down to him. "Cover the house." Caleb came down the ladder, his face streaked with soot, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. He looked at Lila. A quick, hard glance. "Stay down," he commanded. And then he was out the back door, moving in a low crouch toward the barn. Lila was alone with Elias. The shooting from the front had lessened, the two remaining gunmen content to keep them pinned down. Then, she heard a crash from the back of the cabin, followed by a grunt of pain. She turned to see Elias stagger backward from his window, a dark red stain spreading across his chest. He looked down at his wound with a kind of mild surprise. Then his eyes met Lila's. He tried to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. He collapsed to the floor, his shotgun clattering beside him. For a moment, Lila was frozen in pure, unadulterated terror. Elias was dead. Caleb was outside. She was alone. Through the shattered window, she saw one of the hired guns rising from behind a rock, his rifle aimed not at the house, but toward the barn where Caleb had gone. He was going to shoot Caleb in the back. Without thinking, without allowing her fear to paralyze her, she raised the rifle. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. She remembered Caleb's instructions. Sight down the barrel. Pull the trigger. She rested the rifle on the edge of the window frame, aimed at the shape of the man, and fired. The recoil slammed the butt of the rifle into her shoulder. A brutal, shocking force. The explosion was deafening. Through the smoke, she saw the man jolt, drop his rifle, and crumple to the ground. She had done it. She had shot him. Nausea rose in her throat, hot and bitter. Before she could process what had happened, the barn door was thrown open. Silas Croft stood there, a pistol in his hand, a triumphant, savage look on his face. His fine clothes were now disheveled, but his arrogance was untouched. He had found another way in. "Now, Elspeth," he said, his voice laced with venom. "Your protector is busy. It is just you and me." He started toward her, his intentions clear in his eyes. She tried to raise the rifle again, but her arms were weak, shaking. He was almost to the cabin door when a shape emerged from the side of the barn. It was Caleb. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead. His shirt was torn, and he was covered in dust and blood. But he was alive. The last of Silas's men lay dead at his feet. Silas saw him and stopped, his face twisting in a snarl of pure hatred. He raised his pistol, not at Caleb, but at Lila, who was framed in the cabin doorway. "You see," he screamed at Caleb. "She is mine, even in death!" He was going to shoot her. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. Lila saw the dark hole of the pistol's muzzle, saw Silas's finger tighten on the trigger. Then there was a deafening crack, louder than all the others. It was not from Silas's gun. Silas Croft jerked backward as if struck by an invisible fist. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. His eyes went wide with shock, the triumphant look replaced by one of utter disbelief. He looked down at his chest, then back up at Caleb. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He crumpled to the ground, his fine coat settling in the dirt around him. It was over. Silence descended, absolute and profound. The only sound was the ringing in Lila's ears and the ragged sound of her own breathing. Caleb stood for a long moment, his revolver still aimed at the body of Silas Croft, smoke curling from the barrel. Then he lowered it, his shoulders slumping. He walked slowly toward the cabin, his steps heavy. He looked at the body of the man Lila had shot, then at her, his eyes asking a question. She could only shake her head, tears finally streaming down her face. He stepped over the threshold and knelt beside Elias, gently closing his old friend's eyes. He rose and came to her, pulling her into his arms. She buried her face in his chest, the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood filling her senses, and sobbed. She wept for Elias, for the man she had killed, for the terror and the violence, and for the simple, quiet life they had lost. They stood like that for a long time as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the terrible carnage of their victory. But even in the shelter of Caleb's arms, Lila knew this was not the end. Silas Croft was dead. He had been a rich man, a powerful man. The men he had brought with him wore stars. However tarnished, they had a legal writ. However corrupt. The town, which already viewed Caleb as a dangerous outsider, would not see a man defending his home and the woman he loved. They would see a killer. The law Silas Croft had twisted to his own ends would now come for Caleb. And this time, it would be real. The aftermath was a hollow, ringing silence. The sharp reports of the rifles had been replaced by the drone of a lone fly buzzing over the still forms in the yard. The sun, now high and indifferent, baked the dust in the dark, spreading stains on the ground. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the bitter scent of spent gunpowder. Elias lay covered by a clean sheet on the floor, a still and silent testament to the terrible cost of their victory. Lila had cleaned the gash on Caleb's forehead, her hands steady now, moving with a numb purpose. The terror had receded, leaving behind a vast, aching emptiness. She watched Caleb as he moved through the cabin, his face a mask of grim resolve. He was not looking at her. He was looking through her, his eyes fixed on a future she could not see, a future he was already planning without her. He gathered what little food was left, wrapping it in oilcloth. He took his revolver, cleaning and reloading it with methodical, detached movements. He went to the small wooden chest where he kept his money and a few personal effects and slipped them into a leather saddlebag. Every action was precise, weighted with a finality that made Lila's blood run cold. He was erasing himself from this place. She found him in the barn, throwing a saddle over his dark stallion, the best horse he owned. He moved with a brutal efficiency, his hands pulling the cinch tight, his jaw set like granite. He was a man preparing for a long and difficult journey. He was preparing to run. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice small in the vast, shadowed space of the barn. He did not stop his work. "You heard what I told you to do before. Now I am doing it. I am riding out. They will come for me, but I will not be here. With me gone, they will have no reason to bother you. The ranch, the deed is in the cabin. It is yours. No one will dispute it." His words were like stones, hard and lifeless. He was giving her everything he had, and in doing so, he was taking everything that mattered away. He was severing the bond they had forged in silence and fire, casting himself back into the wilderness, back into the darkness he believed was his only true home. He was doing it to protect her, but it felt like the cruelest kind of abandonment. "So you will disappear," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "And I will stay here, on this land that is soaked in blood, with the grave of the man who died for us just outside the door. I am to live with that, while you ride away and become a ghost?" He finally stopped, his hand resting on the pommel of the saddle. He turned to face her, and the raw pain in his eyes was almost her undoing. "It is the only way. Lila, Silas Croft was a rich man. He had friends, powerful men who will want someone to pay. They will not care about the truth. They will only care that I killed him. If I stay, they will hang me. And they will drag you through the mud, call you a whore and an accomplice. They will destroy you. I will not let that happen." "And what about what we have done?" she demanded, taking a step toward him. "What about Elias? Did he die so you could run, so we could give up? I will not do it. Caleb, I will not let you—" "You do not have a choice," he exploded, his voice a raw cry of anguish. "I bring this on people. I am a plague. I should have never let you get close. I should have made you leave that first week." She walked right up to him, until she was standing toe-to-toe with him, her head tilted back to meet his tortured gaze. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet intensity that was more powerful than any shout. "Before I came here, I was running. I spent every moment of every day afraid. I was a ghost already. This place, this hard and unforgiving land, it is the first place I have ever felt alive. And you are the first person who has ever made me feel safe." She reached out and laid her hand flat against his chest, feeling the frantic, trapped bird beat of his heart. I am not that frightened woman anymore. I am the woman who held a rifle and defended her home, our home. Tears welled in her eyes, but she would not let them fall. Look at your hands, Caleb. They are calloused from building fences and chopping wood. Look at this barn. You built it. We mended the fences together. We survived the winter. We survived them. Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. We built something here. It is scarred and it is broken, but it is ours. We survived. Do not run from it. Do not run from me. He stared down at her, his expression shattering. The hard mask of resolve crumbled, revealing the terrified, lonely man beneath. He saw not a burden he had to protect, but a partner demanding to stand with him. He saw a strength in her that mirrored the untamed resilience of the land itself. She was not asking him to save her. She was telling him they would save each other, or they would fall together. His shoulders sagged, the fight going out of him. He wrapped his arms around her and held on, his whole body trembling with the weight of his unshed tears. For the first time, he was not just accepting his fate. He was choosing to face it, with her by his side. The sheriff arrived 2 days later. He was a tall, weary man named Abernathy, with a kind but discerning eye. He came with 2 deputies, their approach slow and cautious. They found Caleb and Lila sitting on the porch steps, waiting. The bodies of Silas Croft and his men had been buried in a single, unmarked grave on the far side of the hill. A simple wooden cross marked the spot where Elias lay. Caleb stood as they approached, his hands in plain sight. He offered no resistance as Abernathy disarmed him and explained, his voice devoid of malice, that he had to be taken in and held for trial for the deaths of Silas Croft and his men. Caleb simply nodded. As they were about to lead him away, Arthur Denton rode up, his face etched with worry. Denton had been unable to shake the memory of the picnic, the hired man's lewdness, and the cold fury in Caleb's eyes. When word had reached him of the shootout, a deep sense of guilt had settled upon him. He had seen the writ Silas Croft had shown him, and something about it, and the men who carried it had felt wrong. He had sent a telegraph to a friend in the territorial capital, a clerk in the judiciary. "Sheriff," Denton said, dismounting, "I have something you need to see." He handed Abernathy a piece of paper, a response to his telegraph. That writ Croft was carrying was a forgery. The judge he named died 2 years ago, and those men with him, they were not marshals. They had been run out of 3 counties for extortion and violence on behalf of men like Croft. Sheriff Abernathy read the telegraph, his expression grim. He looked from the paper to Caleb, then to Lila, who stood pale but resolute on the porch. "This changes things," he said quietly. "But it does not change the fact that 4 men are dead. There will still be a trial. Croft's family has already hired a lawyer from back east." The trial was held in the county seat, a dusty town that had been buzzing with rumor and speculation since Caleb's arrest. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the heat of too many bodies and the weight of expectation. Lila sat in the front row, enduring the stares and whispers of the townsfolk. The prosecutor, a slick lawyer in a fine suit, was relentless. He painted Silas Croft as a concerned husband, a pillar of the community, desperately trying to rescue his fragile wife from the clutches of a violent, reclusive brute. He portrayed Caleb as a squatter and a killer who had murdered 4 men in cold blood. When it was Lila's turn to testify, a hush fell over the room. She walked to the witness stand, her legs unsteady, every eye in the room a physical weight upon her. She placed her hand on the Bible, her fingers trembling. When the prosecutor began his questioning, his words were like acid, twisting her story, painting her as a faithless, hysterical woman. But then Caleb's lawyer, a quiet, methodical local man, began his questions. He asked her to simply tell her story. She started, her voice a near whisper, recounting her life with Silas. She did not use sensational words. She spoke of the quiet terror, the isolation, the constant fear of displeasing him, the way he treated her like a prized possession, not a person. She spoke of her escape into the blizzard, not as a flight of fancy, but as a desperate bid for her own life. And as she spoke, a change occurred. Her voice, at first shaky and frail, grew stronger. The memories were painful, but speaking them aloud in the light of day, before all these people, was a liberation. She stood taller in the witness box. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, at the jury, and she told them the truth. She told them about Caleb finding her, about his quiet kindness, about the sanctuary he had offered. She told them about the picnic and what Silas Croft's man had said to her. She told them about the forged writ and the terror of the attack. She told them about Elias dying and about the moment she had picked up a rifle to save Caleb's life. By the time she was finished, there was not a sound in the courtroom. The whispers had stopped. The faces staring at her were no longer filled with judgment, but with a dawning understanding, with sympathy. She had not just defended Caleb, she had claimed her own story, her own truth, and her dignity. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for fairness, delivered his verdict the next day. He declared that Caleb had acted in defense of his home, his life, and in the justifiable defense of another. He was a free man. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of fear, but the light, clean silence of relief. The ranch was still standing, scarred but not broken. The bullet holes in the walls were like wounds that would eventually heal into scars, a permanent reminder of what they had endured. In the days that followed, they began to rebuild. They patched the walls, repaired the broken window, and mended the fences once more. One afternoon, Lila took a spade and a collection of wildflower seeds she had gathered and went to the small plot of land where Elias was buried. She knelt in the dirt and began to plant the seeds around the simple wooden cross. She would make this place beautiful again. This was not a graveyard. It was a garden. It was a home. Caleb found her there as the sun was beginning to set. He did not say anything, just stood and watched her for a long time. Later that evening, he took out the old, leather-bound ranch ledger. In it, in his father's careful script, was the record of the ranch's founding. Underneath, Caleb had made his own sparse entries. He opened it to the first page, uncorked a bottle of ink, and dipped a pen. With slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote her name, Lila, next to his own. It was a simple act, but it was a binding one. She was no longer a guest, a refugee. She was a founder of this new life, her name etched into the history of this land as surely as his was. That night, they sat together on the porch, watching the last vestiges of light fade from the sky, leaving behind a canvas of deep indigo scattered with the first stars. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. The world beyond their small valley was still harsh, still dangerous. There would be other struggles, other hardships. Their peace was a fragile, hard-won thing. Lila rested her hand on his. His hand was rough and calloused, but it was warm and steady beneath hers. For a moment, she felt the familiar tension in him, the instinct to pull away, to retreat into himself. But then, it was gone. He relaxed. He did not flinch. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. They sat in comfortable silence, their hands clasped. Two solitary figures no longer alone. The vast, wild land spread out before them. No longer a threat, but a promise. It was their future. Lila looked at their joined hands, then at his strong profile against the twilight. "You did not save me, Caleb," she said softly, her voice clear and sure in the quiet of the evening. "We saved each other. Thank you for listening to our story at the Wild West Campfire. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in English.